Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, let's start with news that the Malaysian United Democratic Alliance, or better known as Muda, has launched a campaign called #PauseMalaysia, urging all politicians to hit the pause button on divisive politics and not to engage in any power grabs. Now, Muda put out 3 requests under this campaign. The first called for a ceasefire among all political parties, arguing that the people are the ones who suffer as a result of the current spate of power grabbing, as they call it. Now, the second request was for no general election to be called while we are currently battling with COVID-19. And the third request was for the government, opposition and independent politicians to come together and find a way to work together. Now, this is quite interesting to note some of the conversations that have emerged from this campaign, Sharaad. I mean, I'm looking at social media and there seems to be, it's quite divisive. There are some who say this pause seems to mean maintaining the status quo, and they're quite unhappy with it. However, others are saying, well, this is exactly what we need. We need to put a pause in all the politicking and focus on dealing with the pandemic.
Well, you know, of course, this call for ending politicking is said by all kinds of people, including those, you know, primarily responsible for much of the politicking in this country. And people, of course, looking at what happened with Sabah, are saying, you know, that Sabah is a prime example of what happens when we do have an election during, you know, at the time of the pandemic. But I must say there's several things. One, Anthony Loke of the DAP issued a call for a ceasefire some weeks ago, largely ignored. And I think this is the big question. So if Muda, represented in Parliament by only one MP, you know, stakes out some sort of moral high ground with this plea for a ceasefire, the question is, who's listening?
Right. Okay, that's a very valid point. I do want to come and look through at the different requests or calls that Muda put out under this campaign. The call for no general election right now, and I do want us to think about that. Granted, we've seen a spike in cases or an increase in the number of cases, but you know, COVID-19 is something that will be with us for some time, for the foreseeable future at least. And you know, I'm wondering how we can think about ways to ensure that democratic rights are not dismissed, you know, for the management of a pandemic.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Americans are going to the elections in November next month. There'll be millions of people. But what we see happening there, very interestingly, is the response to the pandemic situation, allowing people to mail in their vote. Now, Donald Trump has cast aspersions on this. He's suggested there might be fraud involved, but that's his spin on on this particular mechanism. Right. The issue really is, if the Election Commission of Malaysia had done the sensible thing and allowing people to vote who want to go to Sabah to vote in the peninsula where they lived, if we had a system that much more mature that allow for mailed-in ballots, they wouldn't have had the kind of problems that we seem to be having right now.
For sure. We definitely have to have the EC address this because, you know, again, the pandemic is not going to go away. This is just the nature of the time that we live in, and we have to adapt. And I do want to say, though, the idea is pause for how long, right? I think that's been the question that's been posed.
And I think, okay, Melisa, I agree. I mean, my sympathies are with everybody, including the people from Muda, saying we need a national consensus. We need to come together at the time of this pandemic and the deep recession that it's causing globally to find a solution that is a win-win for all Malaysians. But the question is moral pleas enough? Is this kind of exhortation to change from a political class that has really been steeped in self-interest as a motivating factor for much of our political life? Is that enough? What would be the political prerequisites to in fact have a dialogue of national consensus? Would we have to have a national government of national unity, for instance? I mean, these are, I think, really big questions that Muda needs to answer and goes beyond the memes that they seem to like to create.
Well, things to consider for sure. All right, let's take a look at other news. Datuk Sri Azmin Ali has confirmed that he is COVID-19 free after having tested negative twice. Now, this comes following much speculation on Azmin's health status after several politicians and government officials were found to have contracted COVID-19. It's also very interesting interestingly raised the question of public officials' obligation to be transparent about their health versus, say, principles of patient confidentiality.
Yeah, Melissa, I think, personally, I'm quite ambivalent about the situation, especially we call on politicians to reveal their health status. This is something that is not unique to the COVID-19 situation, but it's also kind of a measure of how politicians deal. Individual politicians have either been very transparent about their situation, about their choice to self-quarantine, whereas others have, created a shroud of mystery and a bit of drama around their own status. And I don't know which plays better for the public, they look at it. But
if we were to say, take a broader view, look at this from a larger picture, I think it goes beyond. I mean, COVID's really changed the nature of the game for transparency of, politicians, public officials' health status. If we think about, say, by-elections or those who choose to contest, politicians who choose to contest in elections, should they be making their health status official or at least known to the public before contesting, right?
Yeah, there's, there are all kinds of fascinating things that go into the mix when it comes to revealing your personal health status, because politicians don't cease to be private individuals, I think, in many ways. But coming back to the COVID situation, in some ways, the public health imperatives mean that we all lose some level of our privacy. We had it over the contact tracing, yes. Contact tracing. And so when and if you are part of the network that gets called up, you will have to reveal very private details about where you've been, who you've met, and the kind of relationship you had to those people. And so I think that has become a kind of moral obligation on our part as individuals to give up some of our privacy in order to benefit the larger community.
I wonder how much of the perhaps unwillingness of some politicians or some people to not want to say or to be transparent about where they've been or their health status in terms of the optics, right? If being caught out as having skipped quarantine or not stayed home where you're supposed to, or attended events with the knowledge that you haven't abided by the guidelines, I think that's bad optics, and you might lose some political good faith there. So perhaps that's the reluctance to be that transparent, Yeah,
and there's also, I think, finally, the question of, this is a disease that affects everybody. You don't have to have a moral failing in order, as people impute about other diseases, in order to catch COVID-19. Anybody can catch it anytime.
No discrimination.
Right? So there's no shame in admitting that you're positive, and I think that's something
the shame could come from not following SOPs, though.
Absolutely.
That could be shamed.
Endangering other people, not a good thing.
Okay, all right, we're going to take a quick break. After this, we will be taking a closer look at the prison department's move to reduce the prison population to prevent the further spread of COVID-19. All of that coming up in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
The war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of the new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
COVID-19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid close conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax. We need to be vigilant.
No, the war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris Sharaad Kuttan. Now, after much concern about being a policy blind spot, the Prisons Department has announced initiatives to stem rising COVID-19 infections under their watch. They are now going to be looking to release early inmates who have been sentenced to less than 1 year imprisonment and have less than 3 months remaining on their sentence. Now, this will also, the Prisons Department will also move 2,300 inmates of the Dangerous Drugs Act to national service camps, which have been gazetted as temporary prisons. However, is this all too little, too late? Joining us on the show right now, we have Salim Bashir, President of the Malaysian Bar. Salim, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you could begin by talking us through the legality of this early release proposal. What are the laws that enable the Prison Department to do this?
Thank you, Melisa and Sharaad, for having me on the line. Yes. Today we were told that the Prison Department came up with a new directive to actually release the prisoners who have served a certain period of sentencing, and also to segregate prisoners sentenced for drug abuse to a separate locality, gazetted locality. This is being done under the Prison Act 1995. Section 43 of the Prison Act 1995 actually grants power to the Minister to gazette and give a guideline for the Director General, that means the Commander of Prison, to actually release prisoners on licensing for a certain period of time. There's a terms and conditions actually. You can actually release the prisoners and then subject to the conditions. And after the license expires, they have to brought back to the cell, brought back to the prison to serve the remaining sentence.
This is very interesting because you're saying that, in effect, they're not having their sentence commuted. It's just they're temporarily relieved of incarceration. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true. Do not be deceived by the fact that it is a early release. No, licensing release is a condition where you actually go out there, you serve your sentence outside the prison facilities, and I do not know how long the licensing requirement is for him to serve the remaining sentence outside the prison facility. After it expires, he will be brought back to the prison cell. If he still have to serve the remaining sentence, then he has to do it in the proper prison facilities.
Okay, Salim, the question is now, with those empowered to do this, could the prisons authorities extend this to other categories of prisoners, considering that this is all being done because of the pandemic and the pressures that we have in our overcrowded prisons? Could it be extended to older prisoners? Could it be extended to prisoners with minor crimes, for instance, if such a distinction exists in the law? How far can the Prisons Department take this to address this very critical problem that we have now?
Yeah, the Bar Council are aware of their move now to release a segment of prisoners that committed non-serious crimes. That means basically a maximum sentence of 1 year, and those who have got remaining sentence of only 3 months to be released on license. We hope that the prison authorities also could consider a conditional release on license to detainees who have sentenced for an offence, for those who have committed an offence more than a year, and also to actually give the priority. I can't say that they have to, because there are some people who are in a vulnerable category who have committed a serious offence. So these people may not be considered, but the priority should be given to the vulnerable group, like taking into account their age factor, their compromised immunity, and their health conditions, to be considered to be released on license.
Okay. Well, Salim,
and another thing that the prison authorities also should consider, they should actually ask the people on the vulnerable groups to apply for parole. Parole needs to be applied. So the detainees actually can apply to the parole board for them to be serve their remaining sentences outside the prison cell.
Sorry, the onus to do that is on the prisoner or the prison's department?
So they are on the prisoners.
On the
they
prisoners.
have to apply, and the prison, the parole board should take into account the pandemic situation at the moment and exercise leniency in their discretion to grant parole.
Okay, on the note of leniency, and I want to point out that back in April, I believe the Prisons Department Director General had written to the federal courts urging for the courts to stop jailing people for violating the MCO, saying that, you know, overcrowding in prisons was a problem. Now, talk to us, Salim, about the role of the court's discretion in helping to reduce the prison population.
Okay, we acknowledge the fact that, you know, the prisons are overcrowded. Okay, all these, you know, the prison authorities are trying their best to contain the spread of virus in prison by providing masks, ensure sufficient SOPs and all that. But however, the problem of overcrowding in prisons could hamper all these good efforts of controlling social distancing among inmates, which can be a source of infections. So what they did is, because of not many prisons in the country, now, as far as Klang Valley is concerned, there are two big prisons, there is Sungai Buloh and Kajang. And don't forget, Sungai Buloh is only meant for remand prisoners awaiting trial, whereas those who have been sentenced to imprisonment, where the court have concluded their decision after trial, are being sentenced to Kajang prison. And they have written to court, obviously, and asking the court to consider giving alternative punishment than imprisonment. The alternative punishment can be anything other than imprisonment. It can be from fine to community service or born of good behavior and so on.
Salim, what is the likelihood of that happening? We've seen the Prisons Department take months to respond to many calls and warnings about how prisons will become a ticking time bomb, and we've seen that already transpire, and only now they've acted. Will the courts themselves respond in a timely fashion? Are we going to see the wheels of justice or the judicial mind move very slowly before this is actually addressed?
Now, we are actually pleading. We are pleading for the court to exercise judicial discretion of reducing the number of people being sent to prison to stop overcrowding. And the prison authorities can't do much, because when people are getting in, you know, they have to, the only way out is either you build a new prison or you can categorize a locality as a prison. You get it gazetted. That is the only way you can actually contain this and adhere to the social distancing. Other than that, there are no way out. And they have to work within the Prison Act, whatever empowered under the Prison Act.
Okay. All right. Well, Salim, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for helping shed some light on this matter. We really appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Thing is what? He did mention.
Hi, Tong, can you hear us?
Hi, Tong.
Yes. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Tong, I was reading your book
bookshelf,
and then got the chapter on prison, so I shall be quoting from that. Oh, you can't see. Okay.
So I wrote that in mid-April.
Yes, 15th of April. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's so precise.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation on how to curb the spread of COVID-19 in detention environments. Now, COVID-19 is not going to go away anytime soon, so how do we make prisons more SOP compliant? Part of this is looking at significantly reducing the prison population. Joining us on the line now, we have Liew Tong, Senator of Dewan Negara. Now, welcome. Thank you for joining us on the show. Now, I want to point out, you previously had raised the issue of overcrowding in prisons and raised the concern that this is, as Sharaad mentioned a bit earlier, a ticking time bomb regarding the spread of COVID-19. Now, I want to know your thoughts, Tong. Was this move by the prison department enough in your estimation?
I think it is not enough to depend on just the prison department. It has to be a whole of government approach. So the court has to come in, the police has to come in, the Home Ministry has to coordinate, and there needs to be a whole of government approach to deal with the question. You cannot just depend on the prison department alone. And fundamentally, our prison is overcrowded. Our prisons are overcrowded. Our system can only take about 52,000 inmates. But at the moment, we are having between 68,000 to 72,000 inmates averagely. So that is the fundamental problem that we have to deal with.
Tong, one of the proposals that were announced last night was that those in prison for minor drug offences will be moved out to other spaces of incarceration. Now, this might relieve those buildings that are now the official prisons, but will it... are we just kind of outsourcing the problem, as it were? We're just moving people who are still going to be in conditions that will be ripe for infection.
I think eventually we will have to very quickly reduce the number of prisoners to about 50 or 52,000, which is the capacity. I mean, what is stipulated in the desired capacity will allow for some space for prisoner in the prison cell, and they will be able to maintain some form of social distancing, although it is not easy. But if we still maintain about 70,000 prisoners or 69,000 prisoners, we will not go anywhere. But
sorry, if I can interrupt you there, the question of capacity, the measure of the 50,000 number that you put out there is kind of prison capacity under normal conditions. We now have a pandemic. Are our prisons even designed for that? Should the numbers actually be much less than 50,000?
Well, possible. I mean, I don't have the answer for that, but I think at the least within the next few weeks, we should strive to actually bring down the number to about 50,000. And from there, we can gauge whether it works or not. But if we do nothing, we will see other prisons facing the same problem. Now, the bigger prison has not actually been hit as yet. The much bigger prison will be Sungai Buloh, Kajang, Kluang, and some of these prisons have not been actually hit as yet. And I hope nothing will happen, but I'm quite worried.
Well, you know, I guess the issue of the concern over the prison population and this environment in which COVID could very easily spread had been raised multiple times by many people over the past few months. It's taken quite a long time for the prisons department to act on it. I'm wondering, Tong, will this have any kind of backlash? Do you foresee this having any political backlash or public backlash to this move?
Yeah, I think I don't blame the prison department itself, because the prison department has to take instruction from the national leadership, from the government. And some of the bigger issues, it needs political will to do. I think there are four major measures that they can look at. Two has already been proposed by the prison department yesterday. One is to move some of the detainees because of minor drugs offences to other places. Actually, what we should be looking at is decriminalizing drug usage. That means if this guy is a drug addict, you put them into a drug, what they call rehab, rather than putting them into prison. I think that is a big problem. And actually, our prison takes about 70% of our prison inmates has something to do with drugs at different level. So I think that is one major problem. We have to think about how to decriminalize drug usage. The second proposal by the prison was to put some of the inmates on release on license. I think that is a good suggestion. That involves about 11,000 people, 11,000 inmates. I think the third idea is that actually out of the prison population, out of the 69,000 prison population, actually 25,000 of them are actually remand persons. So they have not been convicted. They are on remand. Some of them are for non-bailable offences. Then I think we leave it aside. But that many of them may be remanded because they don't have money to pay for bail, and they are not able to afford to pay for bail. I mean, this group of people can be dealt with differently. And I also think that the prison has to be a bit more humane, which is to deal with the older prison inmates. There must be a way to handle people who are above 65 years old, above 70 years old. I don't think during COVID period we want to keep inmates who are 85 years old. I think that is something that we should seriously consider. So these are the 4 proposals, and I hope these 4 ideas can be implemented very quickly in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah,
so that we can bring down.
Chintan, very interesting, because you mentioned this next few weeks several times now. The urgency. Will it require, as you said, national leadership, but, you know, the role of, say, an amnesty, and we see this happening in many countries. It happened in the early part of the pandemic globally. Iran released prisoners. Around the world, prisoners were being released. We didn't follow that trend.
Yeah.
Could there be a mechanism that cuts out the legalities, that pushes this momentum forward very quickly? What would that be?
I think the Home Minister and the Prime Minister will have to make a decision and say, okay, this is urgent. Let's do it at least in the next 2 weeks, bring it down to 50,000 people, and then we examine whether 50,000 people within our system is still sufficient to deal with COVID, or we still need to bring down further. And I think there are many inmates in our system who do not necessarily have to be jailed. Many of the minor offenders can be put on community service, and that will not bring them into the prison system. I met many prison officers. They are very worried. Even a year ago, they were worried about TBs. They were worried about minor offenders going to prison and going to the university. They call this the prison as the universities, and graduate to become a major criminal.
Okay, but again, that's a major. Coming back to something Melisa brought up, is a public reception of this policy push. Will there be a lot of people saying you are going to be endangering the lives of the general public by allowing criminals to run free now? Your explanation around the pandemic notwithstanding, do you see that possibility as a backlash from the public?
I think the public is brought up to think about law and order, and we have this law and order argument that let's lock everyone up and then let them rot inside the prison. But I think the pandemic shows us that it's not just about the prisoner. There are also prison guards. There are also contractors in the prison. There are also families of the prison guards. But they are, when it comes to COVID, it will spread. Whatever happened in the prison will have a consequence on the society. So I think in this pandemic situation, we will need some political will, and we will need everyone to think about how to deal with this problem holistically. Of course, I'm not saying that you release them straight away, because you also need to quarantine them so that to ensure that whoever you release do not bring what they call pre-existing infections into the community. And that is also something that we have to deal with. And we may need to call in other organizations, NGOs, community organizations, to help some of these minor offenders or some of these very old prisoners, so that they don't rot inside the prison and therefore creating a more serious pandemic.
Tong, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Really appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night, folks.